Chapter 1: Shadows at Dusk. Elias stood at the corner of the alley, one hand buried in the deep pockets of his coat, the other flexing against the chill that wasn't entirely from the weather. The rain slicked the pavement, turning the city into a fractured mirror of itself, reflecting neon signs and flickering street lamps that gave the night an unnatural sheen. It was a quiet evening, save for the hum of distant traffic and the rhythmic drip of rainwater off gutters. A typical night, the kind he used to enjoy. Now it only reminded him of how long he'd been running, how much of a fool he had been to think he could outrun it. His gaze cut across the street, focused on a shadow darting between the buildings. His sharp eyes tracked the movement, a flicker of interest that didn't belong in the face of someone who'd grown numb to the dangers of the city. A stray dog, its fur matted and grimy, pelted across the rain-slicked asphalt, a fleeting blur of desperation. Elias's eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, the animal froze in its tracks, locked in place as though caught in some invisible snare. The muscles in his neck tensed. For a moment, the air thickened, vibrating with something deep, primal, something older than him. He could feel it crawling beneath his skin, scratching at the surface of the man he was now. He shook his head, but the glint in his eyes, sharp and feral for a split second, lingered, even as the dog bolted into the shadows, oblivious to the turmoil that had just brushed past it. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the city's hum. He pushed away from the wall, boots crunching on the broken pavement, the faint sound almost lost beneath the rain's gentle assault. His thoughts drifted back to the only thing that seemed to keep him tethered to this world, the curse. It gnawed at him constantly, a gnawing, restless hunger that had never quieted, no matter how far he ran, no matter how many faces he wore. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a storm that threatened to swallow him whole. A man alone with demons, he thought, his chest tight with the familiar weight of it. That's what I am. His hand tightened into a fist. He didn't belong here. Didn't belong anywhere, really. Not with this burden, not with this monster lurking inside him. He kept walking, the familiar beat of his own steps, an odd comfort in the silence of the streets. But it wasn't enough. Nothing ever was. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, the weight of its indifference. It wasn't until the alley ended and he stepped into the glow of the next street lamp that the noise in his head started to dull, even if only slightly. His pace slowed. He'd learned long ago to listen to the undercurrent of the city, to the pulse of life that surged through the cracks, the smell of wet asphalt mixed with something else, something foul. His senses sharpened, more than they should have. A flicker of motion to the side caught his attention, an abrupt rustle, something small moving fast. His body tensed before his mind could catch up. Another animal. A cat this time, sleek and fast, darting through the shadows of the alley, eyes gleaming like molten gold. Its gaze flickered to him for a moment before it disappeared into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Elias's pulse quickened, the glint in his eyes returning, stronger this time. Restless, agitated. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, sucking in a sharp breath through his nose. The scent was there, faint but distinct. The animal's presence lingered in the air like a phantom, but it wasn't the animal he was focused on now. It was his own reflection in the storefront window that caught his eye. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. His hair, damp from the rain, hung in messy strands over his face. The shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, endless battles with the dark parts of his soul. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. His face was no longer just a face, it was a mask. And that was the problem. The city stretched out before him, a maze of cracked sidewalks and flickering lights, and he kept walking. His own reflection was nothing more than another shadow in the dark. But the man he was becoming was something far more dangerous than just a reflection. It was the thing that hid beneath his skin, the curse that had followed him, bound him, since he was too young to understand it. He could feel it stirring, even now, like a storm waiting to break free. A sudden crack of thunder echoed in the distance. But Elias didn't flinch. He was already moving. He'd learned long ago that there was nothing to fear from the storm, only from the things it might wake. Marissa stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, watching the dark swirls of cream dissolve into the rich liquid. The cafe was quiet this afternoon, the hum of conversation, a soft undercurrent to the clink of porcelain cups and the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. Outside, the world moved at its usual frantic pace, but inside, here, it felt different. Calmer, slower, like the hours stretched out just a little longer than they should. She sat in the corner, a spot she often chose when she needed to think. Her back to the wall, a book open before her, though her eyes barely flicked over the pages. The words blurred together, not from the dim light, but because her mind refused to settle. The same question circled endlessly in her thoughts. Why did she feel like something was missing? Why did every relationship, every encounter feel like it only scratched the surface? She was tired of the surface. Her fingers gripped the edge of the cup, the warm porcelain a small comfort, the steam rising in faint tendrils. It was the kind of day that made her restless, peaceful yet full of longing. She didn't know what she was searching for exactly. Maybe answers, maybe connection. Whatever it was, it had eluded her for a while now, and she hated that feeling. "Mind if I join you?" The voice, smooth and warm, pulled her from her thoughts, her gaze snapping up. The man who stood before her was older, his hair peppered with gray but still thick, his sharp eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. A quiet strength radiated from him, the kind of person who didn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. He was the kind of man who had lived through things, who had learned from them. She offered a small, polite smile, motioning to the empty seat across from her. "Of course, take a seat." He slid into the chair with ease, his movements deliberate but relaxed, as though he had no urgency to be anywhere else. He glanced down at the book on the table, then back at her, his expression one of quiet understanding. "Still searching for answers in there?" he asked, nodding toward the open pages. Marissa chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I think I'm just distracting myself today. Can't seem to concentrate on anything for long." "Ah," he said with a knowing smile. "The mind always wanders when it's searching for something." She studied him for a moment, sensing the weight of his words. Something about him seemed to carry an old wisdom, the kind that came with years of experience. He wasn't just talking about books, he was talking about her. "Are you always this observant?" she asked with a raised brow, amusement tugging at her lips. "Sometimes," he said, his smile never wavering. "Other times, I just know when someone's searching for something they can't put into words." He paused, his eyes softening slightly. "You're looking for something deeper, aren't you?" Marissa blinked, surprised at how easily he had read her, but she didn't shy away. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I don't know what it is. I feel like I've been going through the motions for too long, meeting people, having conversations, but never really connecting. Like I'm missing a piece of the puzzle, and I don't even know where to start looking for it." He nodded as though he understood entirely, leaning forward slightly. "The funny thing about pieces is that sometimes we can't find them until we stop looking so hard. It's only when we let go of the search that we stumble across something unexpected." She didn't answer immediately. His words felt true, like something that was just out of reach but familiar. Maybe she had been too focused on finding something specific. Maybe the answer wasn't a thing to be found, it was a feeling, a connection. But how did you find that? How did you let go of the search when the longing gnawed at you every day? The silence stretched for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She could tell he wasn't in a hurry to fill it, wasn't pushing her to speak. She appreciated that. "Are you saying I should stop looking for answers?" she asked after a beat, her voice softer than she expected. "No," he said, his tone firm but kind. "I'm saying that sometimes we need to stop searching for what we think we want and start paying attention to what's already in front of us. Life is like that. It doesn't always go according to plan, but the moments that matter most usually surprise us." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and oddly comforting. She found herself leaning back in her chair, exhaling slowly as she let the weight of his wisdom settle in. He wasn't offering solutions, just guidance. He wasn't here to tell her what to do, but to help her see that maybe the answer she was looking for wasn't far off. It was a strange kind of reassurance, one that made her feel like she wasn't alone in this search. He studied her for a moment, as if considering something before he spoke again, quieter this time. "There's something about you," he said, his eyes sharp yet gentle. "A resilience that's been buried under the surface. You've got the heart of a fighter, Marissa. You just need to trust it." She blinked, her heart beating a little faster as his words landed, deeper than she expected. How did he know her name, and why did it feel like he was seeing right through her? Not just into her, but past her, into the part of her that she hadn't even fully acknowledged. She started, but the words felt stuck. "How do you know my name?" He smiled, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Let's just say I've been watching you for a while. It's hard not to notice someone with that much potential." Her brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could ask more questions, he held up a hand, stopping her. "Not today," he said with a soft laugh. "Today is just about you listening. To me and to yourself. The rest will come when you're ready." She nodded slowly, feeling a strange pull in her chest. He wasn't just talking about life. He was talking about her, her potential, her future. There was something more here, something she couldn't quite grasp yet, but she was starting to feel it, and whatever it was, she had a feeling she was closer to it than she had ever been before. She watched him for a long moment, the quiet stretch between them no longer uncomfortable. It was as if, in this strange meeting, she had found the first real connection in a long time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this man had just given her a glimpse of the answers she hadn't known she was seeking. Marissa had almost forgotten about the cup of coffee she was still holding, its warmth a comforting presence in her hands. She took another sip, the rich bitterness grounding her as she thought about the conversation she'd just had. Her thoughts, however, were suddenly interrupted by the soft, familiar voice of the older man she had seen earlier standing by the door. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a gentle smile. Marissa blinked, slightly startled, but then nodded. "Of course," she replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. He lowered himself into the chair with an easy grace, the slight ache in his movements betraying his age, but his energy was sharp. He wore a well-worn blazer, the kind that had seen years of life and love for art, with paint stains speckled on the sleeves as if they were part of his history rather than accidents. His silver hair was long, tied back neatly, and his hands, though old, still held an artist's steady precision. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marissa had learned to be comfortable with silence, especially in the presence of someone who seemed as content with it as she was. It wasn't awkward or rushed. It was simply a shared moment of quiet acknowledgement. The man studied her, his gaze thoughtful, perceptive. "You seem like someone who's carrying more than they let on," he smiled as he said it, not with judgment, but as if he'd seen something buried in her. "You're good at hiding it, though." Marissa looked up, surprised by his bluntness, but there was no malice in his tone, just curiosity. His eyes weren't intrusive, just wise, as though he had seen life from every angle and found some peace in the chaos. She started, but hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure of whether she even had the words to explain the weight that she hadn't been able to shake for years. He waved it off, offering a quiet chuckle. "No need to explain. I only ask because I've been there myself. It's easy to carry burdens, but harder to let them go." Marissa shifted in her seat, the familiar ache of holding things in swirling inside her. She didn't want to burden him with her thoughts, yet the longer she sat with him, the more she realized she wasn't burdening him at all. "Do you think it's possible to find what's missing?" she asked before she could stop herself. "I mean, is there something out there that can fill the emptiness, or do we just settle?" He tilted his head slightly, eyes softening as if she had just said something he understood too well. "Some people search for answers outside themselves, in things or in other people, but sometimes the hardest truth is that the answer you're seeking is already inside you. You just have to be willing to face the parts of you that you've been avoiding." Marissa exhaled slowly, her hands tightening slightly around her coffee cup. "You're saying that we have to face the darkness to find the light?" He leaned in slightly, his eyes steady on hers. "Sometimes, love means embracing the darkness in order to find your true self." The words hung in the air between them, filling the space with an energy that was both heavy and soothing. Marissa's chest tightened. It was as if he had spoken to a part of her that she had long ignored, or maybe a part of her that she had been afraid to acknowledge. She blinked, her mind running through the meaning of his statement, turning the words over and over as if they were a puzzle. But what if the darkness is too much? What if embracing it means losing who you are? The man smiled softly, his eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had lived through battles, through moments of self-doubt, and had still come out the other side. The darkness doesn't take you. It shapes you. It refines you if you let it. And sometimes that's where the light is born. But you'll never know unless you take the first step. Marissa was quiet for a moment, digesting his words. His presence was a strange kind of reassurance, like he was encouraging her to take that step. She didn't know why she felt compelled to listen, but she did. "Thank you," she said softly, feeling a sense of connection to him that was hard to describe. She had come in here today feeling lost, unsure, and now, even though her mind was still swirling, there was a flicker of something different, something like clarity. The man gave her a small nod, like he had given her exactly what she needed and was content with that. "Sometimes the right words arrive at the right time. You'll figure it out, Marissa. You just need to trust yourself." He stood up, offering her one last look. "Don't be afraid of what you'll find, no matter how dark it may seem." She watched him walk away, his figure blending into the bustling cafe, but the weight of his words stayed with her, lingering in the air like the faint scent of coffee. She didn't know what to do with them yet, but she knew they were important. The seed had been planted. She would carry it with her now, even if she wasn't sure where it would lead. Marissa sat back in her chair, staring out the window, the rain still coming down in steady sheets. His words played over and over in her mind, echoing in the silence. She didn't know what darkness she needed to face, but she knew there was something, some piece of herself, that she hadn't been willing to look at. Something that, if embraced, might finally bring her the connection she had been searching for. But was she ready to face it? Her heart raced a little faster as the thought lingered. She wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Marissa moved through the art exhibit, the soft shuffle of her shoes on the polished floor mixing with the quiet murmurs of other visitors. She had always found solace in art. There was something about how it captured raw emotion, the kind of emotion she often struggled to express. It was like looking into someone's soul without them speaking a word. The gallery's walls were lined with works that felt almost too alive, the vibrant strokes and shadowed corners pulling her into their depths. She stopped in front of a painting of dark hues of crimson and charcoal swirling together, depicting a figure caught in an eternal struggle. The emotion it evoked was visceral, uncomfortable even, but she couldn't look away. It was as though it mirrored the turmoil she carried with her daily, the restlessness she could never shake. Her fingers brushed lightly over the back of a chair beside the painting, but just as she was about to move on, her gaze caught something, or rather, someone. She blinked, not sure what had pulled her attention, but when she looked again, there he was, Elias. He stood by a tall, stark painting, his body language rigid but not tense. His hands were in his pockets, the collar of his jacket turned up slightly, his posture relaxed but closed off. He wasn't engaging with anyone, just standing there in a quiet solitude that felt deliberate, as though the chaos around him couldn't touch him. But it was the way he stood, his back straight, eyes focused on the painting but not really seeing it, that drew her in. There was something about him, something about the way he carried himself, that set him apart. The crowd around him moved, as they always did in such spaces, oblivious to the man with the kind of sorrow that seemed to hang heavy around him like a cloak. Marissa's breath hitched as she took in the sharp features of his face. His jaw was strong, his profile almost sculptural, but there was a wariness in his eyes that told her this man had seen more than he was willing to show. There was a kind of pain in him, buried deep enough that only someone looking for it would recognize it, and she was looking. She tried to tear her gaze away, to move on, but something about him rooted her in place. Something inside of her stirred, a recognition that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't explain. She wanted to turn, to pretend she hadn't noticed him, but every part of her felt drawn to the space he occupied, to the dark aura that clung to him. She finally pulled her eyes away, but it wasn't easy. There was something magnetic about him, as if his presence tugged at something inside her that she didn't know was there. Her heartbeat quickened and she caught herself glancing back again, only to find him still standing there, unbothered by the world. For a moment she wondered why she was so fixated on him. He was just another person in the room, just another person whose life she would never touch. Yet there was something that made her want to understand him, to know why he looked as though he was hiding a storm behind those tired eyes. Elias shifted slightly, his gaze catching hers for the briefest moment, and the world seemed to freeze. For a split second, time stretched and everything around them disappeared. His eyes, dark and intense, locked onto hers, and it was like they were the only two people in the room. The air thickened, charged with an undeniable pull. She quickly looked away, heart racing in her chest. What was that? She hadn't expected it, hadn't expected the jolt of electricity that zipped through her at the brief contact. It was as if he had reached inside her, stirred something she didn't know was there, and then pulled away just as quickly. Marissa bit her lip, frustrated with herself. Get it together, she told herself. She had come here to lose herself in the art, to clear her mind, not to get distracted by some stranger who likely had his own baggage to carry. But even as she turned away, trying to find something else to focus on, her thoughts kept drifting back to him, the way he stood there alone in his own world, his stillness, his presence, the quiet sadness that lingered in his eyes. It was like he was wrapped in a silent, unspoken mystery, one that Marissa couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. The more she tried to ignore him, the more she found herself drawn back to him. It was as though there was an invisible thread between them, one that she couldn't see but felt deep inside, pulling her toward him with an intensity that both frightened and intrigued her. She exhaled slowly, gathering her courage, and made her way across the room, telling herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But as she approached the corner where he stood, her steps slowed. She wasn't sure what she intended to say or why she was even approaching him, yet something in her told her that this moment, this crossing of paths, wasn't an accident. It felt inevitable, like the universe had nudged her toward him for a reason. Elias, sensing her approach, shifted slightly, turning just enough that their eyes met once again. This time there was no jolt, no electric tension. It was simply an acknowledgement of her presence, of their connection, however fleeting it was. "Interesting piece, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, smooth, but with a rough edge to it. Marissa hesitated, her heart still racing. She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, it's intense. Powerful." He tilted his head, his gaze flicking back to the painting before returning to her. "The most powerful pieces aren't always the most beautiful," he said, his tone almost reflective, as if the words carried more weight than the painting itself. "Sometimes they're the ones that make you uncomfortable, that make you face something you'd rather not." Her breath caught and she swallowed, unsure of how to respond to the weight of his words. There was something more here, something beneath the surface, and she could feel herself being pulled deeper into it with each passing second. For a moment they stood there in silence, the space between them charged with a quiet intensity that neither of them seemed willing to break. Finally, Elias gave her a small, knowing smile. "I'm Elias," he said simply, offering his hand, though it wasn't an invitation she was used to. It wasn't the casual politeness of strangers, it was something else, something more intimate. Marissa hesitated, her pulse racing again, but she extended her hand anyway, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was brief but electric, sending a ripple through her that made her wonder if this was the beginning of something more than just a fleeting encounter. "Marissa," she replied, her voice unsteady, though she wasn't sure why. Elias nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back slightly, as if the brief connection had unsettled him as much as it had her. "Well, Marissa," he said with a soft, almost mysterious smile, "it was good to meet you." And with that he turned, leaving her standing there, wondering if she'd just experienced something life-changing or if it had been nothing at all. But she already knew the answer. Marissa fidgeted with the hem of her jacket as she watched Elias glance at the painting again. There was something in the way he looked at it, a distance, a wariness, as though the art was a mirror he dared not examine too closely. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, the instinctive need to fill the silence suddenly becoming overwhelming. "It's strange," she said, breaking the quiet, "how a piece like this can make you feel so unsettled, like it's not just the image but something else that seeps into you, almost like it's asking you to confront something you'd rather leave untouched." Elias didn't immediately respond, but she caught the way his lips pressed together, his eyes flickering to the side. There was a shift in his posture, just a subtle tightening, a quick dart of his gaze, as though her words had unearthed something inside him. "Yeah," he said, finally speaking, but his voice was soft, like he was testing the weight of his own thoughts. "It's like that sometimes. It taps into places you didn't know existed." His eyes didn't meet hers this time. They were fixed on the dark strokes of the painting, but there was an edge to his words that felt too personal, too weighted. Marissa couldn't quite place it, but she felt a stirring of unease in her chest. She wasn't used to being so attuned to someone else's mood, but with Elias it was different. His aloofness, the way he held himself, made her feel like there was something untold beneath the surface, a storm he was keeping locked away. Her curiosity deepened. "I don't think I've seen anything quite like it before," she said, her voice gently probing, almost coaxing. "There's something about it that makes you want to know more, even when it's unsettling." At this, his gaze flicked to her, and she felt a sharp, unspoken recognition pass between them. It was fleeting, gone before she could fully grasp it, but in that brief moment she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't just guarded but deeply conflicted, something raw but quickly masked. "It's just a painting," he said with a shrug, his words dismissive, though his expression didn't quite match the indifference he was trying to project. "Some art is just made to provoke, to stir things up. It doesn't always have to be so intense." Marissa nodded, though she didn't entirely believe him. There was a wariness in his tone that suggested the painting, maybe even the very conversation, was cutting closer to something he wasn't ready to share, and that only made her more intrigued. She leaned in slightly, trying to gauge his reaction without being too obvious. "I'm sure," she replied softly, "but sometimes art reflects a part of us that we don't always see. Maybe it's not about what's there, but what it brings out in us, what it forces us to face." For the briefest of moments, his eyes met hers fully, a flicker of something in them, something almost vulnerable, raw. It was gone in an instant, but it left a trace, a tremor between them that she felt deep in her chest. His gaze hardened then, and he shifted, turning slightly away as if he regretted the moment of openness. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a painting. Doesn't mean it has to be anything more than that." Marissa hesitated, unsure whether to push further or let the moment pass. The air between them felt charged now, like a thread tugging them closer even as he pulled back. She wanted to understand him, to know what was beneath that exterior, but she also knew that sometimes pressing too hard made people retreat further. Instead, she smiled, though it was gentle, accepting. "I guess that's true. It's up to the viewer to decide what it means, right?" His lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, but his eyes still held that elusive distance. "Exactly." He said it like a finality, a closure, but his voice carried an unspoken tension, one she couldn't shake. Marissa felt the magnetic pull between them again, stronger this time. It was subtle, an undercurrent of something more, but she could sense it. She knew he was fighting it, whatever it was, between them. His eyes kept flicking to the side, his fingers tapping impatiently against the edge of his coat. He was clearly uncomfortable, but there was something about his discomfort that made her want to stay close, to figure out what he was trying so hard to hide. She tilted her head, studying him more intently now. "You know," she began, her voice soft but probing, "sometimes when something unsettles us, it's not because it's bad, it's because it's real. It forces us to look at things we'd rather ignore." His gaze flickered again, but this time she didn't look away. The tension thickened, swirling around them, as if they both knew there was something they were dancing around. He inhaled sharply, but when he spoke, his words were laced with something a little softer, more honest, though still guarded. "I'm not sure it's that simple," he said quietly, eyes not meeting hers. "Sometimes it's not about facing things. Sometimes it's about surviving them." Marissa's heart skipped at his words. There was so much pain in that single statement, so much that she could feel it, like an echo in her own chest. He wasn't just talking about the painting. He was talking about something much bigger, something that hurt. Before she could respond, he stepped back slightly, shifting the conversation away from the deepening tension between them. "Anyway," he said, voice brisk now, "I'm sure you have other paintings you want to see." Marissa didn't protest, though a part of her wanted to ask more, to push for the truth she could see lurking behind his guarded exterior. She knew that if she stayed, she would unravel something, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it, if he was ready for it. "Maybe I will," she said quietly, offering a small smile, her voice full of understanding, even if she wasn't entirely sure she understood. Elias nodded, his gaze flickering over her face once more before turning back to the painting, as if closing himself off once again. "It was good talking to you, Marissa." Her name on his lips sounded different, softer, almost like a secret. "Yeah," she whispered, "it was." And just like that, the connection between them flickered and dimmed, but Marissa knew it was far from over. She wasn't sure where it was headed, but she felt it. Something had been set into motion tonight, and whether they were ready for it or not, there was no turning back. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. Marissa stepped out of the gallery, the cool night air brushing against her skin as the door swung closed behind her. The city felt different at night, quieter but heavier, like the weight of the day was settling into the bones of the streets. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional honk of a car were the only sounds that punctuated the stillness, the flickering streetlights casting long, jagged shadows on the sidewalk. She wrapped her arms around herself, half to ward off the chill and half because she could still feel the weight of the conversation she'd just had. Elias's words lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord, making her feel both drawn to him and wary of what it all meant. There had been something raw in his eyes, something that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. As she walked down the street, the rhythmic click of her heels against the pavement was a constant companion. People have confessed to me that they felt a sense of relief when they started to read Trent, and to shake off the strange tension that clung to her from the gallery. That was when she saw him. Elias stood under a flickering street lamp a few yards ahead, his figure almost blending into the shadows, but she recognized him immediately. There was something about the way he held himself, something distant, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders and he didn't quite know how to carry it. It was a feeling she understood too well, but unlike him, she didn't have the urge to hide it away. Her steps slowed, a curious pull drawing her toward him despite the lingering hesitation in her chest. She hadn't expected to run into him here, in this quiet part of the city, but then again she hadn't really expected to run into him at all. He turned slightly, his posture rigid when he noticed her approach. The briefest flicker of something unreadable passed across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same guarded expression he wore so effortlessly. "You?" he said, his voice low but not unwelcoming. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Marissa tilted her head, her curiosity piqued once again. "I could say the same about you. What brings you to this part of town?" "Just walking," he replied, his eyes flicking to the side for a moment before meeting hers again. "Sometimes it's easier to think when you're moving." She nodded, understanding all too well. Sometimes moving was the only way to keep from being trapped in your own head. The street lamp above them flickered, its glow casting an eerie, uneven light that played across their faces. The air was still, too still, and the tension between them seemed to grow thicker, like something invisible pressing in from all sides. Marissa shifted on her feet, feeling the weight of the silence stretch longer than comfortable. She couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking, what was going on behind that guarded exterior. The more she observed him, the more she felt like there was something just beneath the surface, something he wasn't letting her see. Elias let out a sharp exhale, his shoulders stiffening in a way that sent an involuntary shiver through Marissa. For a moment it seemed like he was fighting something that wasn't just the night or the quiet or the weight of their conversation. His eyes darkened just for a fraction of a second, and his jaw clenched so tightly that she could hear the faintest scrape of his teeth. Marissa's pulse quickened. Something in the air shifting, she could feel it now, the subtle undercurrent of tension running through him, the way he seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. She instinctively took a step back, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of the sudden change in him. Without warning, Elias's body tensed even further, and his gaze snapped to the shadows ahead, his posture rigid, as though every fiber of his being was on alert. His breath hitched, a low growl, almost imperceptible, rumbling from his throat. Marissa's stomach twisted, but she couldn't look away. The rawness in him, the sudden shift in his demeanor was too compelling. It was like she was seeing something that wasn't meant to be seen, something beneath the surface of the man standing before her. The raw flash of something wild, something untamed, flickered in his eyes. In the dim light of the street lamp, it was like a shadow passing across his face, a brief glimpse of something animal, something dangerous. For a heartbeat, she wasn't looking at the man she'd met at the gallery. She was looking at something else, something primal, untethered, and just as quickly it was gone. Elias blinked, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog in his mind. The moment passed, leaving him standing there once again, the calm, guarded figure she had grown familiar with. But it was different now. His energy had shifted, and Marissa couldn't ignore the unease creeping into her chest. He didn't speak for a long while, his eyes avoiding hers, and she wondered if he even knew how much of himself he had just revealed. Finally, he cleared his throat, the tension in his body easing as he took a step back. "I should go," he said, his voice suddenly distant, like he was closing off parts of himself that had briefly opened. "It's getting late." Marissa opened her mouth, unsure of what to say, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? "Are you okay?" She barely knew him, but she felt this strange, deep pull to ask, to offer something, but instead she swallowed the urge, nodding slightly. "Good night, Elias," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered to her, a brief, almost apologetic look crossing his features before he turned away, his footsteps quickening as he disappeared into the night. The air around her felt colder suddenly, like the weight of what had just happened hung between them, thick and heavy, refusing to dissipate. She stood there for a long moment, her chest tight, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep within her. What had she just witnessed? What had that raw flash of violence, that glimpse into his true nature been, and why did it feel like everything she thought she knew about him, everything she thought she understood, was unraveling before her eyes? The night had shifted, and she was left standing in the quiet, grappling with the pieces of something she couldn't yet comprehend. Marissa stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, the sound almost deafening against the sudden quiet of the night. The air felt thick, pressing in on her from all sides as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Elias' transformation, his shift, whatever it had been so fast, so raw, that she couldn't quite process it. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the image of the dark, animalistic flash that had overtaken him. Was that fear? Was that danger? Or had she witnessed something much deeper, something real? The uncertainty gnawed at her. Her chest was tight, the adrenaline that had surged through her moments ago now turning to a slow, simmering confusion. Her body still hummed with the aftershock of it, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her mind, on overdrive, tried to latch onto anything that made sense, but the flickering images, the dark gleam in his eyes, the harsh tightening of his jaw, kept crashing against her thoughts like waves against jagged rocks. What the hell was that? Her instincts screamed at her to turn and leave, to run from whatever had just broken through Elias's calm facade. But there was another part of her, the part that had felt the weight of his isolation, the part that had seen his vulnerability through all the walls he built, that couldn't just walk away. Something in her, something that had been stirred deep inside, refused to let the image of him go. It's not danger, she thought, trying to convince herself, though the uncertainty still clawed at her. It's something else, something broken. Her mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them fit. The fleeting snarl she had barely heard, like it was swallowed up by the night itself, reverberated in her ears. The way his gaze flickered toward her darkened as if fighting an unseen battle. And that brief moment when he looked at her, when the man she had spoken to so casually disappeared in favor of something wilder, something more dangerous, was burned into her memory, etched there in jagged lines. Was he hiding something? Was that what he didn't want me to see? She swallowed, her mouth dry as her thoughts tangled together in an uncomfortable knot. The rawness in his eyes had cut deeper than she'd realized, and now she was left standing there, alone in the wake of it. Her breath came faster now, a sharp inhale followed by a shaky exhale. Her body's fight-or-flight response had been triggered, but she wasn't sure which one to follow. The fear she felt was foreign, distant, but the pull to stay, to understand, was stronger. It was an odd mix, a deep sense of empathy crashing against a natural, primal wariness that made her heart beat a little faster, a little. The wind stirred, the faint rustling of leaves carrying the distant echo of his brief growl, though she couldn't be sure it was anything more than the night itself. Her mind, however, wouldn't let go of the image of his posture, the way it had shifted, the sudden tension in every muscle like he was on the verge of tearing himself apart. The memory of the raw, unguarded animalism that had bled through him felt like a brand against her skin, an indelible mark she couldn't shake. Her fingers trembled slightly at her sides, and for a moment she wondered if it had been a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in control. But she knew better. What she'd seen had been too real, too sharp to be ignored. The subtle way his body had coiled, as though it was preparing to lunge, was not the behavior of someone simply troubled. It was the behavior of someone battling something far more dangerous than just their emotions. Could it be? Could he be hiding something more than just pain? The thought hit her like a jolt, a sudden clarity that both terrified and intrigued her. Could he be hiding the very thing that had made him so unreachable, so closed off? She had always known there was something behind the guarded eyes, but now she realized that it wasn't just sorrow or anger or regret. It was something darker, something that even he couldn't contain. Her mind raced as her eyes lingered on the spot where he had stood moments ago. The street lamp flickered again, its light casting long shadows down the empty street. There was nothing there now, no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been more than just a man she'd shared a fleeting conversation with. But she could feel it, the weight of what she'd seen, the shift in the air that hadn't quite dissipated, as though it was still hanging there, waiting for her to acknowledge it. And she did. She knew deep down that she couldn't unsee what had happened. She couldn't just forget the look in his eyes or the way his body had betrayed him, if only for a moment. She had witnessed something that would unravel the quiet mystery of Elias bit by bit. But what? And why did it feel like she was already caught up in the very unraveling she had no idea how to stop? The walls of Marissa's apartment felt smaller tonight, the air heavier. The quiet hum of the city outside had faded into the background, but her thoughts roared in her head, relentless and sharp, as if they were clawing at the edges of her sanity. She paced back and forth in her living room, her mind a chaotic blur of questions, her heart thumping in her chest. What was that? The memory of Elias, his eyes darkening, his posture shifting, the raw flash of something dangerous, played on an endless loop. She couldn't shake it, couldn't stop the image of him from surging forward every time she tried to focus on anything else. It wasn't just the flicker of aggression she'd seen in him. No, it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp, but it was real. She felt it in her bones. She stopped in front of her couch, staring down at the coffee table that now seemed too small, too ordinary, to contain the weight of the questions pressing on her. Her fingers drummed impatiently against the edge of the table. Her gaze drifted toward her laptop, still open on the coffee table, the screen casting a dull glow in the dim room. The urge to understand, to find an answer, any answer, was overwhelming. She sank into the couch, her fingers shaking slightly as she pulled the laptop toward her. She opened a browser, the words werewolf folklore typed into the search bar before she even realized she was doing it. Her mind was racing, and she knew exactly what she was looking for, even if she didn't fully understand why. She clicked through a few links, her eyes scanning the pages of old cryptic text. Her mind was clouded with fragmented images from the night, the way Elias had tensed, the sudden ferocity in his eyes, the low growl that had barely escaped his throat. And then there was the moment, the most unsettling moment, the animalistic shift that seemed to come out of nowhere. It had been brief, so fleeting, but it had been there, unmistakable. She felt it like a brand, a scar she couldn't erase. This isn't just a coincidence, she thought, a chill creeping down her spine. There's something more to him, something I can't explain. Her eyes flicked to the screen, where ancient texts about shifters and curses flickered before her. Cursed werewolves was the term that jumped out at her. She clicked on the link, her fingers hovering over the keys, and a wave of dread washed over her. She knew the stories, ancient myths that spoke of werewolves who were cursed to remain in human form, forced to suppress the wolf inside them. She had never believed them, of course. Who would? But the more she read, the more she realized that what she had seen in Elias was something that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or simple emotion. Her heart raced as she scanned more passages, reading about curses bound by blood, about the struggles of wolves trapped in human skin, their instincts clawing to break free. She couldn't help but compare the stories to Elias. The more she read, the more the pieces fell into place, though she was still hesitant to believe it, still hesitant to acknowledge what she was beginning to suspect. Could he really be one of them? The thought was too absurd, too insane to fully accept, and yet the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The way he had reacted that night, how he seemed to be fighting against something inside himself. It wasn't just a man battling his own emotions, it was something deeper, something primal. Her hands curled into fists, frustration mounting in her chest. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to stop, to dismiss the idea as ridiculous. But the rest of her, the part that had seen something raw and wild in Elias, couldn't let it go. She couldn't stop thinking about that flash of darkness in his eyes. What do I do now? Marissa let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through her hair, and glanced at the clock on the wall. Hours had passed, and yet it felt like no time at all. She had barely noticed the progression of the night. She'd been too lost in the whirl of her thoughts, the growing need for answers that seemed to be clawing at her from the inside out. She closed the laptop with a snap, her frustration turning to restlessness. Her hands trembled slightly, a byproduct of the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She rose from the couch again, the urge to do something, anything, almost suffocating. Her mind wandered back to Elias, his guarded demeanor, his quiet words that hinted at something more. And then there was the memory of the animal in him, the moment of vulnerability that had briefly flashed before her eyes. Her heart thudded in her chest as she paced again, trying to make sense of it, trying to ground herself in something that felt real, something that made sense. She stopped by the window, gazing out into the street below. The city was alive with noise, but it all felt distant, like a world she couldn't reach. Elias was part of that world, wasn't he? A world that seemed so far removed from her own, where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided and she had no idea how to navigate it. Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. What was she supposed to do? The thought of confronting him again, of asking him about what she had witnessed, made her stomach twist. She didn't even know how she would begin. What if she was wrong? What if she was just imagining things, projecting her own confusion onto him? But what if she wasn't? What if Elias was hiding something much bigger than she had ever imagined? Her pulse quickened at the thought, a surge of nervous energy building in her chest. She had crossed a line the moment she'd decided to look deeper into the stories, into the world of shifters and curses, and now there was no turning back. But what did that mean for her? Was she walking into danger? Or was this the beginning of something that could finally give her the answers she had been searching for her whole life? Her eyes flickered to the phone on the counter, her fingers itching to pick it up, to reach out to him, but something held her back. She wasn't sure what it was, fear, doubt, or something else entirely. Her breath steadied as she made her decision. It wasn't time to confront him, not yet. But soon, she would find out the truth, and when she did, nothing would ever be the same. The room was bathed in shadows, the only light coming from a dim lamp on a side table. It cast long, distorted shapes against the walls, stretching over the clutter of old photographs and mementos, fragments of a life he no longer recognized. His gaze lingered over a framed photo of a younger version of himself, eyes bright and full of hope, before he quickly turned away. The man in the picture wasn't him anymore, not the one who sat in the dim light, fighting a war within himself every day. Elias ran a hand over his face, his fingers rough against the stubble growing along his jaw. He leaned back in the worn armchair, his eyes unfocused as they stared into the dark corner of the room, trying to find clarity in the swirl of chaos that raged inside him. His breath was steady, but the tension in his body told another story, one of constant strain, of a life lived on the edge of control. How long can I keep pretending? The thought was a familiar one that had haunted him for years, but tonight it felt different. Marissa's face flashed in his mind, her gaze soft but steady as it had locked with his. That damn look of understanding in her eyes, that unspoken empathy, it had been enough to stir something deep inside of him, something he couldn't ignore, something he didn't know if he wanted to face. His grip tightened on the armrest, and he could feel his heartbeat picking up pace as he thought of her. Her quiet strength, the way she'd leaned in just a little closer when they'd spoken, her eyes searching his as if she could see past the mask he wore. What the hell am I doing? He'd spent years building walls, creating a life where he didn't have to confront the truth of what he was. The wolf inside him, primal, vicious, hungry, was always there, just beneath the surface, gnawing at the edges of his control. He had fought it, controlled it, but tonight he wasn't sure if he could anymore. The instinct was too strong. He closed his eyes, the weight of his curse pressing down on him, the gnawing hunger clawing at him like a beast desperate to be set free. He had spent so long denying it, locking it away, but there were moments, like tonight, when the walls felt thin, fragile. What if she finds out? The question settled in his chest, cold and sharp. He had kept his distance from people for so long, never allowing anyone close enough to see what he was. But Marissa had seen him. Even in the briefest moments, she had caught something in him that he hadn't been able to hide. She'd seen the struggle, she'd felt it, and that terrified him. The idea of letting her in, of showing her the darkness inside him, was a risk he wasn't sure he was willing to take. He had never been good at trusting others. People betrayed, they left. But she wasn't like the others, was she? She had a quiet strength, a compassion that seemed to pull him in despite all his efforts to remain distant. But that didn't change the fact that his curse could tear her apart. He wasn't a man who could offer the kind of love she deserved. Not when every part of him was a storm, constantly at war. He let out a breath, the pressure of his thoughts almost unbearable, and looked at the floor, fighting the internal battle that raged within him. Does she deserve to know? Could she handle it? And there was the real question, wasn't it? It wasn't about her discovering the truth. It was about whether he could face her, face the one person who might be able to see him for what he truly was, and still stay. His mind raced with the possibility, his heart pounding as the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. Marissa had shown him kindness, yes, but he knew better than anyone how easily that could turn into pity. And pity wasn't love. Pity never saved anyone. He clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up from deep within him. But what if she could be the key? The idea was both a glimmer of hope and a dangerous fantasy. He had never let anyone close enough to risk it. Not like this. Not like her. But maybe, just maybe, her compassion, her ability to see beyond the surface could be what broke the curse. Maybe she could help him reclaim what he had lost, the man he used to be before the wolf had consumed him. But it was a gamble, a dangerous one, and if he was wrong, if she couldn't handle the truth, it could cost him everything. His chest tightened, the raw reality of his situation closing in on him. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not again. Marissa sat at her desk, her eyes flickering over the pages of her research, the words blurring in front of her as the weight of the night's events continued to press in. The uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant undercurrent in her thoughts. Elias's sudden shift, the unguarded pain she had glimpsed in his eyes, it was all too much to ignore. She had known there was something about him, something buried, something he kept locked away, and now she knew it wasn't just emotional turmoil, it was something darker, something deeper. The question that had plagued her all night was simple. What was it? What was he hiding? Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, her thoughts racing as she clicked through more pages of folklore and myths. each click taking her deeper into a world she hadn't known existed, until now. The words shifter and curse kept resurfacing, twisting in her mind like a knot she couldn't untangle. Every part of her screamed that there was something to this, something she couldn't explain but needed to understand. He's not like other people, is he? Her heart raced with the thought, the weight of it sinking deep into her chest. The more she thought about him, the more she realized her life was no longer just hers. Elias had carved his way into her world, whether she was ready for it or not, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had pulled them together for a reason. The stakes had been set. Neither of them could walk away untouched. Not now. But where would that path lead them? Her hand paused above the keys, and for a moment the silence was deafening. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. Their worlds had collided, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 3. Crossing the Threshold. Marissa stood at the edge of the park, her breath visible in the crisp night air as she gazed at the silver sliver of a crescent moon hanging low in the sky. The park was quiet, almost eerily still, save for the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. It had taken everything in her to come here tonight, to finally face the uncertainty that had taken root in her chest since that moment with Elias. But she couldn't ignore it any longer. She couldn't run from it. She knew what she had to do. The decision had gnawed at her all day, the weight of it heavy in her stomach. She had spent hours turning it over in her mind, questioning her every impulse, her every thought. But there was no mistaking it now. The connection between them, no matter how fragile or terrifying, was undeniable. She couldn't walk away from him, not when she knew he was carrying a burden so much heavier than his silent demeanor let on. He needed her. And she needed to understand, needed to know if what she had seen in him, what she had sensed in that brief moment, was real. Her gaze flickered to the figure standing at the far end of the park, partially obscured by shadows, but still visible enough for her to recognize. Elias. He had been waiting for her, though his posture betrayed none of the tension she could feel in the air. There was a stillness about him now, an unreadable calm, as if he too was waiting for something, waiting for her to make the first move. For a long moment they simply stood there, the distance between them heavy with unsaid words, the unspoken weight of everything that had happened so far hanging in the silence. Finally she stepped forward, her heart pounding, her nerves tingling. She couldn't keep standing on the sidelines, couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't drawn to him, drawn to his pain, to his struggle, to the part of him that he kept hidden away. She wanted to help him. More than that, she needed to. When she reached him, she stopped a few feet away, her gaze never leaving his. "Elias," she said softly, the words coming out more fragile than she had intended. "I don't know what's going on with you, but I know you're not okay. I've seen it, the way you fight it, whatever it is. I can't just walk away from this. I want to help you." His eyes met hers, the dark intensity in them almost too much to bear. He didn't speak right away, his expression unreadable, but the air between them felt charged, like something unsaid had finally broken free. I'm not asking for help," he replied, his voice rough, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't need anyone to see what I've become." "You're not broken," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was firm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. "Whatever you think you've become, Elias, it's not too late. You don't have to keep fighting this alone." For a long moment he just stood there, his eyes searching hers like he was weighing her words, trying to determine whether they held any truth. She could see the internal battle playing out behind his eyes, the same tension she had sensed in him that night. "You don't understand," he finally muttered, a hint of frustration breaking through. "I've done things I can't undo, and no matter how much I want to, I can't control what's inside of me. I can't just let go of it." She stepped even closer, her heart aching as she saw the depth of his torment. She reached out, a gentle touch on his arm, hoping that in some way her presence could give him the reassurance he needed. "I don't care what's inside of you, Elias," she said quietly. "What matters is what's inside of you now. You're still here, you're still fighting, you don't have to do it alone." The vulnerability in her voice hung between them, and for the first time he seemed to falter. His gaze softened just slightly, and the walls he'd built around himself cracked, even if just a little. "You'd really help me?" His voice was barely above a whisper now, raw and uncertain. "Even after what you saw?" Marissa nodded, a small but determined smile curving on her lips. "Yes, I don't know what I'm walking into, but I'm not going to leave you to fight this alone. Not now." He stood still for another moment, as if contemplating the weight of her words, but finally he exhaled slowly, a quiet acceptance settling in his expression. His jaw clenched, and he nodded once, sharply. "All right. If you're sure about this, I won't stop you." She smiled, relief washing over her. "I'm sure." In that moment, a silent pact formed between them, an unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Marissa felt like she wasn't walking it alone. Elias had let her in, and that meant something. Without another word, Elias turned, his footsteps slow at first, then steady as they walked side by side, leaving the quiet park behind. The city street stretched out before them, the familiar hum of life now feeling distant, like they were both walking into a different world, a world where the rules had changed and everything they knew was about to shift. The street lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. As they walked, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with the weight of the unknown, and Marissa felt the pull of something greater than herself, greater than either of them. They turned off the main road, moving deeper into the darker, less traveled alleys that led into a part of the city she had never seen. Abandoned buildings loomed in the distance, their windows like empty eyes staring out into the void. There was something ominous about the place, something ancient, as if the city itself was hiding secrets that had been buried for generations. But it wasn't just the physical journey they were embarking on. Marissa could feel it deep inside her. The way their lives had already intertwined, the way fate had drawn them together, and now there was no turning back. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no fear in her, only the quiet certainty that this was the only way forward. And Elias, walking beside her, his presence both a comfort and a mystery, was no longer just the man she had met in the gallery. He was something else now, something she was determined to understand, and together they would face whatever lay ahead, no matter how dark or dangerous. As they disappeared into the shadows, the city around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The low hum of the old-fashioned bell above the door announced Marissa's arrival before she had even stepped fully inside. The scent of aged paper and herbal tea wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. It was a stark contrast to the bustling city streets outside, and she welcomed it. This place was a sanctuary, an anchor in the chaos of everything she had been unraveling lately. "Marissa," Lena's voice called out from the cluttered back room. "Come in. It's a mess in here, but it's home." Marissa smiled at the familiar warmth in Lena's tone as she made her way through the small, narrow hall toward the room where her friend worked. The door creaked as it opened, revealing Lena sitting at a cluttered desk surrounded by stacks of papers, books, and artifacts that seemed to pulse with ancient energy. She was hunched over a thick tome, flipping through its pages with an intensity that spoke volumes about her dedication. Lena was everything Marissa wasn't. Practical, blunt, and unwavering in her skepticism. Where Marissa wore her heart on her sleeve, Lena hid hers behind a veil of logic and reason. But it was that balance that had made them fast friends. Lena was the one Marissa turned to when her idealism needed grounding, the one who could offer a perspective that was as steady as it was sharp. Lena didn't look up immediately, her brow furrowing deeper as she muttered to herself. But when she did, her eyes softened at the sight of her friend. "I knew you'd come. I figured you'd want to talk about that." Marissa hesitated in the doorway, a small sigh escaping her lips. "I'm not sure I'm ready for what I might hear," she confessed, walking into the room and sitting across from Lena. "But I need to understand everything that's happened with Elias. I can't just ignore it anymore." Lena closed the book in front of her with a soft thud, her sharp eyes narrowing. "I told you before, Marissa. You're walking into something dangerous, but you never listen, do you?" A smile tugged at the corners of Marissa's lips despite herself. "You know me too well. But it's not just curiosity anymore. There's something about him. Elias. I can't shake it. It's like I'm being pulled into something much bigger than both of us." Lena's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hardness to it. "I've seen this before. The connection you feel, it's real, but it's also dangerous. You have to be careful, Marissa. People like Elias, they don't just heal. They're burdened by things, by curses that have existed for centuries, and they're not easy to undo." Marissa's heart tightened, but she knew Lena wasn't the kind of person to throw out warnings without reason. She met her friend's gaze. "So, you think Elias is cursed?" Lena sat back in her chair, running a hand through her dark hair before crossing her arms over her chest. "You've been reading up on this stuff, haven't you?" she said, her voice dry but not unkind. "If he's truly cursed, then he's bound by something ancient. Rituals, pacts, bloodlines. Some of it goes back thousands of years. These kinds of curses don't just go away because someone wants them to." Marissa nodded slowly, processing Lena's words. She had already been diving into ancient lore on her own, searching for anything that might explain Elias' behavior, his shifting moods, the flashes of something darker she had seen in him. But even with all her research, there was still so much she didn't understand. "What kind of rituals?" she asked quietly, leaning forward. Lena shuffled through a stack of papers, pulling out a yellowed piece of parchment covered in archaic writing. "This one, for example," she said, sliding it across the table. "It's about binding a werewolf's power, trapping them in human form so that they're cursed to live without the freedom of their wolf's side. It's an ancient practice, used by groups trying to control the beast within. The problem is, the magic that binds them doesn't always last, and if the curse is broken, well, that's when things get messy." Marissa picked up the parchment carefully, running her fingers over the faded text. "What happens when it's broken?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena leaned back, crossing her arms as she regarded Marissa with a mixture of concern and pragmatism. "The curse might free him, yes, but it could also consume him. The power that's being suppressed isn't something that just fades away. It builds, and when it's unleashed, well, it's not just the person who's affected. Anyone close to them is at risk." Marissa's stomach twisted at the weight of Lena's words. She had known that helping Elias was risky, but she hadn't fully understood the dangers of what she might be getting herself into. She looked down at the ancient script in her hands, her mind racing. "What have I gotten myself into?" "You're sure about this?" Lena's voice broke through her thoughts, and Marissa looked up to meet her friend's gaze. "I've seen people try to save someone with a curse before, and it always ends badly. I know you want to help him, Marissa, but there's a reason Elias keeps people at arm's length, and you're not going to be able to change that." Marissa's heart tightened. She wanted to believe in the possibility of saving Elias. She needed to. "I know," she said, her voice low but determined. "But if there's even the smallest chance that I can help him, I have to try." Lena's eyes softened, but the skepticism never fully left her expression. "Just don't lose yourself in it. He's not going to be an easy fix, Marissa. And when everything goes sideways, and it will, you need to be prepared to walk away." Marissa's heart skipped at the thought, but she swallowed the fear that threatened to rise. "I won't leave him. Not now. Not when I'm just starting to understand what he's been through." Lena sighed, clearly not convinced, but respecting her decision. "You're stubborn," she muttered, turning her attention back to her books. "Just don't say I didn't warn you when things start getting complicated." Marissa smiled softly, a small spark of determination in her chest. "I'll be careful, I promise." But deep down, she knew there was no turning back. She had already crossed the line, and Elias was already too far under her skin. Whatever came next, whatever darkness they had yet to face, she was going to face it with him. Chapter 4. Unveiling Secrets. The underground space was nothing like the world Marissa knew. The dim lighting, flickering lanterns, and candles casting long, trembling shadows against the stone walls made everything feel both foreign and ancient. As Elias led the way through the labyrinth of narrow corridors, her steps were silent, the weight of their surroundings pressing in on her from all sides. The air was thick with an atmosphere that smelled faintly of dust and old books, and there was a hushed tension that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the hidden archive they'd found themselves in. Lena, a few steps behind her, kept her usual determined pace. Her eyes scanned the surroundings with a sharpness that suggested she had been here before. She didn't need to speak. The coldness in her gaze and the set of her jaw told Marissa all she needed to know. This wasn't a place anyone would wander into by accident. It was a sanctuary for the supernatural, its secrets protected by an impenetrable veil of silence. Marissa's heart raced, not just from the fear of the unknown, but from the thrill that coursed through her. She hadn't realized how deeply she had entered this world, how closely she was walking beside Elias. His presence beside her was almost magnetic, drawing her deeper into something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. His eyes were sharp, always darting around the room, alert for any sign of danger, though his face remained impassive. He was different here, more controlled, more like the man who kept his distance from her. They reached a small, dimly lit room at the end of the hallway. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with tattered scrolls, books covered in centuries of dust, and boxes sealed tight with wax and ancient symbols. This place was as old as the curses it held within its walls, and every inch of it seemed to breathe history. "This is where the most dangerous knowledge is kept," Lena muttered, her voice low but confident. "There's no telling what we might find here, but I'll warn you both now, some of it will make you wish you hadn't asked." Marissa swallowed, her nerves tangling with curiosity. Elias didn't seem fazed, though she could sense his own tension in the way his hands clenched at his sides. He was standing farther away from her now, as if he preferred to distance himself from her, from this entire world, even though he was so deeply entangled in it. Lena moved to a table covered in old tomes, her hands flipping through pages with practiced speed. "We need to find the specific ritual that's tied to Elias's curse. One of these should have the answer." Marissa stayed back, watching as Lena dove into her search, but her attention kept flicking to Elias. He was pacing the edges of the room now, his eyes scanning the shelves, the heavy silence between them becoming too much to bear. He was too still, too withdrawn, even for him. Finally, his voice broke through the quiet. "This isn't just about finding a ritual," he said, his tone sharp, tinged with frustration. "We need to know how to undo it. If we can't reverse the curse, if we don't know exactly what we're dealing with, we'll end up making things worse." Lena glanced over her shoulder, her sharp gaze cutting through the air. "You think I don't know that?" Her voice held no warmth, but there was an understanding between them, a recognition of the stakes they were dealing with. "It's not just some curse we're dealing with, Elias. This goes way back. I don't know how to reverse this, but I'm trying to find the information that will give us a chance." Her words hung in the air, their weight settling in the space between them. Marissa felt it how badly both of them wanted this to work, how desperately they were grasping at any shred of hope. It was then that they heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, from the darkened corner of the room. A figure had emerged from the shadows, their presence so quiet that Marissa hadn't even noticed them at first. The figure was tall, cloaked in black, with a face shadowed beneath a hood. "I overheard your conversation," the voice rasped, low and gravelly, "and I have what you seek." Lena's expression hardened, but she didn't flinch. "Who are you?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, they stepped into the light, revealing the sharp, ageless features of someone who had clearly seen far more of the supernatural world than Marissa had ever known. The stranger's eyes gleamed with a dangerous knowledge, and there was something unsettling about the way they carried themselves. Too calm, too confident, as if they knew far more than they were letting on. Elias's posture shifted, the air around him changing as he stepped closer to the stranger, his gaze narrowing. There was something in his expression, something dark and calculating, that made Marissa hesitate. "This information comes at a price," the stranger continued, their voice soft, almost teasing. "And for you, Elias, it's not just gold you'll pay." Elias stiffened at the mention of his name, his body tightening as though he was preparing to snap. His eyes flickered toward Marissa for a fraction of a second, a brief but loaded glance. There was hesitation there, fear, perhaps. A look she hadn't seen in him before. "I'll do what it takes," Elias said. The words clipped, his jaw clenched tight. He stepped forward, meeting the stranger with a cool defiance that sent a chill down Marissa's spine. The stranger laughed softly, the sound rich with a sinister edge. "I'm sure you will." They reached into their cloak and pulled out a faded parchment, its edges worn from age. "But know this. Some curses can't be undone without consequences, and those consequences are always more than you bargained for." Marissa's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Elias take the scroll from the stranger. There was an intensity in his eyes that wasn't entirely human, a flicker of something primal that startled her. For the first time she saw at the edge of danger that he carried with him, the part of him that was darker than even he seemed to understand. As they turned to leave, Elias's words stuck in Marissa's mind. "We're in this together, whether we like it or not." Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment their eyes locked, the air thick with something unspoken. There was tension there, a magnetic pull she could no longer ignore. Her heart raced as the weight of what was to come settled over her. She didn't know how it would all unfold, but she knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about Elias and his curse. It was about them. About something far bigger and far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. As they stepped out into the night, the shadows of the city seemed to stretch and shift, echoing the uncertainty of the journey they were about to embark on. There was no turning back now. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, the air thick with dust and the stale remnants of 100 forgotten years. The walls, once sturdy and strong, had long since begun to crumble, exposing the fragile bones of a place left to decay. Inside, the only light came from the weak glow of a few scattered bulbs that hung from the ceiling, their light flickering sporadically, casting unsettling shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Marissa felt the tension in the air, sharp and suffocating. She walked cautiously beside Elias and Lena, the weight of the unknown pressing in on her chest. She had never seen Elias like this before. His usual guarded demeanor was replaced by something darker, something raw, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The closer they got to the center of the warehouse, the more she could feel it, a growing pressure that built with every step. "Stay close," Elias murmured, his voice low, but the edge in it made her spine straighten. There was an undercurrent of warning in his tone, one she didn't ignore. Lena shot a glance at both of them, her expression tight. "We don't know what we're walking into here. Just keep your guard up." Marissa nodded, though her heart was already racing. They had stumbled upon a rival supernatural pack, one that had its own vested interest in Elias's curse, one that had been watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their move. And now that moment had arrived. They rounded a corner, and the sight of them, 5 figures standing in the dim light, struck like a cold gust of wind. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of the pack, each one clad in dark clothing, their eyes gleaming with something sharp and dangerous. The air around them crackled with the kind of power that made her pulse quicken, the instinct to flee almost overwhelming. But she didn't. They couldn't afford to. The leader of the pack, a tall man with piercing green eyes and a jagged scar running across his cheek, stepped forward, his lips curling into a cold smile. "We've been expecting you," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "The curse has always been a matter of interest to us, and now you've come to us." Elias's shoulders tensed, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You've been watching me." The leader's smile widened, his gaze flicking over to Marissa, then back to Elias. "Watching you, waiting. It's only a matter of time before the curse is ours to control." The tension in the room escalated, the unspoken challenge hanging heavily in the air. Marissa could feel it, the way Elias's body vibrated with the intensity of the moment. It wasn't just words anymore. This was a fight waiting to happen. Suddenly the first move was made. One of the pack members lunged toward Elias, and in the blink of an eye it was chaos. Elias's movements were almost too fast to follow, a blur of strength and power as he dodged the attack and retaliated with a speed that left Marissa breathless. But something was different this time. There was an edge to his fury, a rawness that didn't belong to the calm, controlled man she had known. It was as though the beast within him had been unleashed, unable to be contained any longer. The pack leader stepped forward, raising his hands, his voice laced with authority. "Enough!" But it was too late. Elias's eyes were wild now, his pupils dilated, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood in the center of the fray, his body trembling with barely restrained power. And for a split second, Marissa saw it, the transformation. His body contorted, his muscles shifting and rippling under his skin as though something inside of him was trying to break free. The change was fleeting but devastating, his features distorted, his eyes glowing with an inhuman light, and his hands, his claws, grew sharp and deadly. It was a flash of something darker, wilder, the primal force of the wolf that he kept hidden. The sight was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, and for a moment Marissa couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her heart pounding as she watched him struggle, trying to regain control. "Elias!" she shouted, taking a step forward, her voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. His gaze snapped to her, and for an instant the rawness in his eyes softened. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Enough for him to regain some semblance of control, enough for the wolf inside him to recede, just enough to allow the man to resurface. He staggered back, his body still vibrating with the aftermath of the transformation, his chest heaving as he fought to breathe through the adrenaline that surged in his veins. The rival pack stood back, watching him closely, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The leader's smile had faded, his gaze hardening as he assessed. "It seems the curse is even more powerful than we thought," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. But Elias, breathing heavily, wasn't finished. "I'm not your prize," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't control me." The leader's eyes darkened. "We'll see about that." The standoff was interrupted as Lena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Enough. We've got what we came for." She turned to Elias, her eyes meeting his. "Let's go." Elias nodded, the tension still coiling in his body. As they moved toward the exit, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. They had survived, barely, but at what cost? Once outside, the cool night air was a sharp contrast to the heat of the confrontation. Marissa's chest still rose and fell with the aftermath of the fight, her mind racing. She stole a glance at Elias, who was still visibly shaking, his muscles tense as if he were ready to snap at any moment. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly, her voice soft with concern. Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. When he did look at her, there was something raw in his gaze, something that left her momentarily speechless. "I almost lost it," he muttered, his voice low, filled with a mix of frustration and something darker. "I almost lost control." Marissa took a cautious step toward him, her heart aching as she reached out to gently touch his arm. "But you didn't," she said, her voice unwavering. "You came back." His eyes softened, but only for a moment, before the familiar mask of detachment fell back into place. "It doesn't matter. The curse is still there. I'm not free." Her chest tightened. "Maybe not. But you're here, Elias, and that's a start." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their shared vulnerability hanging between them, but it was clear that this fight, this victory, wasn't over. The road ahead was more uncertain than ever, the danger of the curse and the darkness inside Elias, more real than it had ever been before. And yet, despite the fear, despite the chaos, something had shifted between them. The tension had not only been between the rival pack and them, but within Elias himself. He wasn't just battling the curse anymore. He was battling the fear of what would happen if Marissa, if anyone, truly saw the full extent of who he was. And Marissa? She knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down now. Chapter 5. Shadows closing in. The air was thick with unease as they moved deeper into the darkened streets, shadows stretching long like claws, reaching for them. Elias's pace was swift, each step purposeful, but Marissa couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. The sense of being hunted had never been more palpable. Every corner, every movement felt like it was leading them closer to a trap. She glanced over at Elias, noticing the way his jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning the night with an intensity that made her feel as though even the dark alleyways were trying to devour them whole. Something was different in him tonight. He was on edge. But it wasn't just the external threats. They were closing in, but his internal struggle was something else entirely. "You good?" she asked, her voice low, but the words felt too big to just slip casually between them. Elias's gaze flicked to hers, sharp and unreadable. "I will be when this is over." She didn't know whether he was talking about the enemies lurking in the shadows or the darkness in himself that he was constantly running from. It didn't matter, though. Either way, something was festering inside of him, threatening to break free. The moment they entered the warehouse, the tension hit them like a physical force. The place reeked of old magic, ancient, forbidden power, and Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just surrounded by walls and shadows. No, this place was alive with secrets, hidden whispers, and threats that didn't need to show their faces to be dangerous. Lena, who had been unusually quiet up until now, narrowed her eyes at the shadowed corners of the room. "They're here," she muttered, her voice tight. "The pack is closing in. We're not alone." Marissa stiffened. She'd felt it too. The prickle at the back of her neck, the chill that had crawled down her spine the moment they entered the building. Footsteps echoed from a distance, the sound heavy and deliberate. Marissa turned to Elias, catching the way his posture had shifted, tense, coiled, ready for whatever came next. "This is it," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're getting more aggressive." Lena looked at him, her expression wary. "This isn't just about you anymore, Elias. We're facing more than just the curse. There's something bigger at play." "I know," he said, his voice rough, raw, "but I can't think about that right now. We're running out of time." Before Marissa could respond, the warehouse door creaked open with a slow, eerie groan. A figure stepped into the dim light. He was tall, with sharp features that seemed carved from stone. His eyes glowed faintly, but it was the aura of power around him that made Marissa's heart race. Another leader, another threat. "This isn't just about the curse anymore, Elias," the man said, his voice smooth, carrying an unsettling calmness. "This is about control." Behind him, a handful of other figures stepped forward, the sense of danger mounting. Elias's body visibly stiffened as the man continued. "You don't get to walk away from this," the man added, his smile thin. "Not when we've come this far." Marissa's pulse quickened. As Elias took a step forward, the shadows around them seeming to pulse with his every movement. "I don't need your control," Elias snapped, his voice laced with fury. "And I'm not your pawn." The air thickened with tension, and Marissa instinctively stepped closer to Elias, the unease creeping into her bones. Something had snapped in him. His eyes, dark with barely restrained power, met hers, and for the briefest moment, the animal inside him felt dangerously close to breaking free. She felt it, the force of his emotions, the animal instincts fighting to be free. "Elias," she whispered, reaching out to him, but he didn't acknowledge her. His gaze was locked on the leader, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Elias growled, and the shift in his tone sent a chill through Marissa. It wasn't just anger, it was something darker, something he couldn't control. The man smiled, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "We'll see about that." Suddenly the tension snapped. With a growl that seemed to come from the depths of Elias's chest, he lunged forward, the animalistic power surging through him like a wave crashing against the shore. For a moment Marissa froze, watching in stunned silence as Elias transformed in front of her, his body rippling with raw, untamed power. The shift was brief but brutal, an animal in the man's skin breaking free, claws extending, eyes glowing with feral rage. Marissa stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. This was different from what she had seen before. This wasn't just Elias's struggle with his curse, this was something more, something wilder, more dangerous. His wolf side was in full force, and for a moment Marissa wondered if she had made a terrible mistake being here in this moment with him. The rival pack members backed away, a mixture of fear and respect in their eyes as they saw what Elias was capable of. But Elias wasn't attacking them. He was struggling, fighting the pull of his animal instincts. the raw power of the wolf inside him threatening to consume everything in its path. And then, just as quickly as the transformation had come, it began to recede. Elias stumbled back, his eyes flickering to their human form, his body trembling with the aftermath of the battle he was constantly waging within himself. The leader, his face hardened, stepped forward, but Elias's voice, low, guttural, stopped him. "Leave now," Elias spat, his chest heaving, "or I will make you—" There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Elias wasn't bluffing. The air in the warehouse shifted once again, heavy with the weight of a truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. The curse, the power, the wolf inside Elias. It wasn't just something that could be controlled. It was something that threatened to consume them all. The rival pack hesitated, and then, with a final glance, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marissa's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Elias, his face drawn with exhaustion, his body still trembling with the aftermath of his internal battle. She moved toward him slowly, her voice hesitant. You okay?" Her words felt hollow in the thick silence, but they were all she could offer in that moment. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at her, his eyes dark and weary, as if the weight of everything he had fought to keep hidden was finally breaking through. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words barely a whisper. "I couldn't control it. I'm dangerous." Marissa's heart ached as she closed the space between them, her hand reaching out to touch his arm gently. "Elias, listen to me. You're not a monster." He flinched at her touch, the emotional wall he had so carefully constructed coming back into place. "I don't know what I am anymore." The words cut deep, leaving Marissa with a sinking feeling in her chest. She had come here to help him, to understand him, but with every moment, every step closer to him, she felt the distance grow between them. He was shutting her out, and the darkness inside him was threatening to take over. As they stood in the aftermath of the confrontation, both physically and emotionally drained, Marissa realized the truth. The battle wasn't just with the rival pack, it was with Elias's own demons. Demons that could tear them both apart if she wasn't careful, and now more than ever she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to help him. The ancient chamber was cold, the stone floor beneath their feet smooth with the passage of time, worn by centuries of secrets. Candlelight flickered in the air, casting uneven shadows that danced across the walls, illuminated only by the ethereal glow of the symbols inscribed into the stone. They were here for one thing, redemption. But as Marissa stood beside Elias, her heart thundering in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into the unknown. The ritual was supposed to be their salvation, the culmination of everything they had worked for. It had been meticulously planned, every incantation, every gesture, every symbol meant to break the curse that had trapped Elias in human form. Yet as they stood there in the dim light, surrounded by the scent of incense and ancient magic, Marissa couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at her insides. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she adjusted the ancient parchment in her hands. Elias glanced at her, his eyes dark, filled with a conflict that had grown sharper since the moment they had entered this chamber. He looked at her with a mixture of desperation and hope. "We don't have a choice anymore," he replied, his voice low and tight. "If this works, I'll be free. If it doesn't—" His words trailed off, but the unspoken terror behind them hung between them like a suffocating cloud. Marissa nodded, though the knot in her stomach only tightened. She knew what failure would mean. It would mean losing Elias, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, losing the man he was fighting so desperately to be. The air shifted. Lena stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke the first incantation. The symbols carved into the floor began to glow, pulsating with a power that seemed to crackle in the air like static. The energy in the room grew thick, heavy, and Marissa felt the weight of it on her chest. Her heart raced as she watched Elias, his eyes clenched shut, his hands gripping the edge of the altar as he braced himself for the magic to take hold. The first few moments passed in tense silence, and then, crack! The energy in the room exploded. A sharp, blinding flash of light filled the space, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of it. Sparks flew, the symbols on the stone floor flickering erratically as if they were being torn apart. The entire chamber seemed to tremble, the walls shaking with an unseen force. Elias let out a strangled gasp, his body convulsing violently as the magic took hold. His eyes snapped open, wild, frantic, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His body arched, muscles straining against the intense pressure of the magic, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The ritual was spiraling out of control, and Marissa could only watch in horror as Elias's form twisted, as if the curse itself was fighting back against the spell. "Elias!" Marissa cried out, rushing forward, her heart racing with panic. But before she could reach him, the room exploded with energy. The very air screamed with the force of it, and Elias's scream followed, raw and desperate. "No!" Marissa shouted, hands outstretched as she watched in helpless terror. Elias's body jerked again, his skin flashing with dark, jagged lines of energy that seemed to burn right through him. The ritual was backfiring. Everything was falling apart. He writhed, his breath ragged, and then, just as quickly as it had started, the energy surged violently, throwing both Lena and Marissa back across the room. Marissa hit the stone floor hard, gasping for air, pain shooting through her body, but it was nothing compared to the agony she saw in Elias's face. He lay there, panting, his body trembling as though he were on the edge of life and death, his skin pale and his eyes barely focused. "Elias!" she whispered, scrambling to her feet and rushing toward him. But the closer she got, the worse it seemed. His body was failing him, his hands still clenched tight, nails digging into his palms as though he were trying to keep himself tethered to some last shred of humanity. Lena was already by his side, her hands hovering over his chest, but she didn't dare touch him. "It's not working," Lena said, her voice grim. "The curse, it's consuming him." Elias's eyes flickered open, barely focused on them. I'm losing it. I can't control it." His voice was a strained whisper, barely audible. Marissa's heart clenched. He was slipping away, the very thing they had hoped to destroy. The curse was now consuming him from the inside out. His human side was crumbling, the raw, untamed power of the wolf fighting to break free, and she was powerless to stop it. His body arched again, and for a moment Marissa feared she was witnessing the end of him, witnessing the moment where the Elias she knew, the man she had grown to care for, would disappear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her hands trembling as they reached out for him. "No, don't. Elias, please." The words felt like a prayer, but they were meaningless against the overwhelming power of the curse that had taken hold of him. He wasn't just fighting the magic anymore. He was fighting himself. Marissa couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was watch as Elias slipped away from her, his eyes filled with desperation. His body jerked once more, the agony of his transformation more evident than ever before. She had thought she could save him. She had thought that with enough time and enough hope she could help him conquer the darkness inside, but as she watched him, his eyes losing focus, his body convulsing violently, she realized she had been wrong. She was just as helpless as he was. Her fingers touched his arm, and she felt the heat of his skin, the pulse of life still inside him, but it was fading. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw, like it was the last thing he would say. His words, though soft, cut through her like a knife. "I never wanted this for you." "Don't say that," she gasped, tears threatening to fall, her voice shaky. "Please don't say that. I'm not leaving you. I can't leave you." But the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The battle was lost. The curse had won. Lena stood silently behind them, her face a mask of grim understanding. There was nothing they could do. Not now. The ritual had failed. Elias was slipping through her fingers, and Marissa had no way to stop it. Her heart broke as she realized that the man she had come to care for, the man she had thought she could save, was being consumed by the very curse they had hoped to destroy. She had wanted to help him, but in the end she hadn't been strong enough. None of them had been. Elias's eyes fluttered closed, his body shuddering as if in the last throes of battle, and Marissa in that moment was forced to face the harsh truth. The curse would break him, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Chapter 6. In the Depths of Despair. The cabin was nothing but an empty shell tucked away in the deep woods, isolated from the world. Elias didn't need the noise of the city, the noise of people, or the noise of his own thoughts clashing against one another. Here, in this forsaken place, the silence was suffocating, but it was all he deserved. The cold air crept through the cracked windows, but it didn't bother him. Nothing did anymore. He'd stopped feeling the cold long before his body had become numb to everything around him. He hadn't spoken in days, not to anyone, not even to Marissa, and part of him hated that. Hated that he'd shut her out, but he was broken, wasn't he? That was the reality. The curse, his wolf, his mistakes. They were all part of him now. There was no escaping them. There was no way back to the man he once was. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the silence pressed in on him like the weight of 1,000 years. The walls were bare save for the faint markings of something that had once been alive but now was dead and forgotten. His fingers traced the cracked wood of the bed frame, a simple thing, but it was more than he deserved. He wasn't worthy of even the smallest comfort. I never wanted to be like this. The thought hit him harder than anything. The shame burned through him like a fire that wouldn't die, gnawing at his inside. He had spent so long pushing people away, never letting anyone close enough to see the monster inside, but it wasn't enough. The darkness had always been there, festering, waiting for the right moment to take hold. And now he was nothing but a shadow of the man he could have been. He stared into the cold fireplace, his mind racing with memories of past mistakes, decisions made, lives ruined. His past echoed in his skull like a constant drumbeat. Every choice, every sacrifice he'd made to protect others had led him here, to this moment, to the part of him that no longer recognized the man he'd once been. I never had a chance, did I? He clenched his fists against his knees, the pressure of it almost unbearable. What was the point? What was the point in trying to fight the curse anymore when it was clearly stronger than him? He could feel it inside him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, the wolf, so close to the surface. Every instinct, every pulse of energy within him screamed for release, for freedom from this self-imposed cage. But it would never be enough. He wasn't enough. There was a knock on the door. His head snapped up, the low growl in his chest rising before he could stop it. He didn't want to deal with anyone, not Marissa, not anyone. He didn't deserve her concern. The door creaked open, and Lena's sharp voice cut through the thick silence. "You're going to hide in here forever?" He didn't answer, but his eyes flicked over to the door, watching the shadows play across the cabin. She was the last person he wanted to see, but he didn't have the strength to push her away. "Fine, stay in here and wallow," she continued, unfazed. "But it's not going to change anything. You got your demons, but you're still breathing. That means you've still got a shot at getting your shit together." She walked in and stood in front of him, her arms crossed. "Don't make me drag you out," he gritted his teeth. "I don't need your help." "I know, you never do," she shot back, her tone dry as always. "But here's the thing. Whether you want it or not, you've got people who care about you, Elias, and they're not going to sit around and wait for you to die in here. So get up, stop feeling sorry for yourself, and do something." He just stared at her, his jaw tightening. She wasn't wrong. He'd never asked for help, but the truth was he didn't want it, because if he let anyone in, if he allowed anyone to see the monster he'd become, he would lose them, and he couldn't do that, not again. "Go away, Lena," he muttered. She didn't move, her gaze unwavering. "You're stronger than this, and if you can't see it, then I'm not leaving until you do." She left him with that, and for a moment all he could do was sit there in the cold, suffocating silence, battling the storm inside him. But her words, their weight, stuck with him, gnawing at his resolve, pushing through the layers of pain and guilt until something inside him began to crack. Back at the house, Marissa sat alone in her room, the soft flicker of candles casting elongated shadows against the walls. The space felt almost suffocating in its quiet, the solitude closing in on her, wrapping around her like a shroud. She couldn't stop thinking about Elias, the way he had retreated into the woods, the way he had shut her out, and how helpless she felt. Her heart ached as she thought about him, locked in that cabin, fighting a battle he didn't want anyone to see. But there was more to him than the curse, wasn't there? She had to believe that. She had to hold on to the hope that she could help him, that love could be the key to saving him from the darkness he'd buried so deep inside. But what if she was wrong? The thought tore at her chest, and she leaned her elbows on her knees, burying her face in her hands. Could love really redeem him? She didn't know. The last few days had been filled with fear, doubt, and grief. Her mind kept circling back to that moment, that brutal confrontation when Elias had nearly lost control. The primal rage, the raw power. It terrified her, but at the same time she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. She couldn't give up on him, not when she still believed there was a chance for redemption. A chance to reach the man underneath all the pain. She stood abruptly, her heart pounding with renewed resolve. She couldn't just sit here and wait for him to fix himself. She had to fight for him. She had to be the one to break through, to show him that there was still something worth saving in him. The mentor's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes love means embracing the darkness in order to find your true self. Marissa wiped her tears away, the burning determination rising inside her. She had seen Elias's darkness, but she had also seen the light in him, the man who fought against it, who cared despite the pain he carried. He didn't need to face this alone. She wouldn't let him, and she wasn't going to let herself lose faith in him, no matter how far he fell. Marissa straightened, taking a deep breath. This wasn't over, not yet. She moved toward the door, toward Elias. There was still a chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. The crackling sound of pages turning echoed through the dim cabin as Elias hunched over the worn journal, his fingers tracing the edges of the brittle parchment. The room was still, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams overhead. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to break, casting a faint glow through the cracks in the walls. For days he had been lost in the depths of his own mind, tangled in the horrors of his past, drowning in the guilt that had followed him like a shadow. But now, as his hands moved over the journal's pages, its symbols, its words, its frantic scribblings, he felt something shift inside him. A discovery. A revelation. He had been searching for the key, the solution to his curse, but he hadn't realized how close it had been all along. His breath caught as he deciphered the words, an ancient ritual outlined in painstaking detail. An option that could reverse the curse, but at a cost. His chest tightened as he read further, the weight of the words pressing against him like the very thing they described. A reckoning. The ritual wasn't simple, nor would it be without danger, but it was the only chance. He slammed the journal shut, his heart thudding in his chest. This was it. This was their shot at breaking the curse. The sun had barely risen when Marissa found him sitting on the porch, his elbows on his knees, staring out into the growing light. The fresh morning air seemed to carry with it the promise of change, and yet Elias sat there, wrapped in a silence that felt heavy enough to smother them both. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His silhouette was a mixture of weariness and resolve. He hadn't spoken to her much in the last few days, not since he had locked himself away with his thoughts. She could see it, the internal battle he was still fighting, but now there was something different in the way he held himself. It wasn't just the exhaustion in his eyes, nor the tension in his shoulders. It was the weight of the decision he'd made. The decision to fight. "I found something," Elias said, without looking at her, his voice low but steady. She stepped closer, her heartbeat quickening. "What did you find?" He turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "A way out. The curse. It can be reversed. There's a ritual." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his jaw tightening. "But it's dangerous. It could kill me." Marissa's heart stuttered in her chest, but she held his gaze, unwavering. "Then we'll face it together." He stood abruptly, the intensity in his eyes locking onto hers. "It's not that simple, Marissa." His voice was rough, the words torn from him. "This isn't just about me. I've made mistakes, horrible ones. The things I've done, they're all tied to this curse. I don't know if I can survive it." Marissa reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, grounding him. We survive it, together." Her voice softened, but her resolve was clear. "You're not doing this alone, Elias. I won't let you." For a long moment they stood there, the silence between them thick with all the things they couldn't say. But then Elias' expression shifted, slightly, imperceptibly, and a breath escaped him, as if he were finally letting go of the weight he'd been carrying alone. His shoulders sagged, the tension releasing, even if only a little. "All right," he muttered, his voice hoarse but determined. "Together." Marissa smiled, the first real smile in days, and nodded. "Together." As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the trees, they set to work. The ritual would require ingredients, rare, dangerous ingredients, and the expertise of someone who had walked the shadowed path of ancient magic. They would need to find him, but even with the uncertainty ahead, they knew they couldn't wait any longer. The cost of delay was too great. The curse wasn't waiting. Elias and Marissa, side by side, gathered everything they would need. The atmosphere was a mix of urgency and quiet resolve. Every move, every action felt like it mattered. Marissa took care of the smaller details, writing the incantations, preparing the items, while Elias gathered the rarer components. His mind was still clouded, his thoughts drifting between his past, his darkness, and the hope that the ritual would work. But even as they moved through their tasks, something shifted between them. There was an unspoken understanding now. They were no longer just fighting for the ritual's success. They were fighting for each other. As the hours passed, the preparations were nearly complete. The air between them hummed with anticipation, but also something else, a quiet understanding that they were on the precipice of something huge, and no matter how daunting, they would face it. Together. "We're ready," Marissa said softly, standing beside him, looking over the collected ingredients, the parchment of ancient symbols. Elias nodded, though his gaze lingered on her, the weight of their bond clearer than ever before. "This is it," he muttered. "There's no going back." She stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened just enough for her to see the gratitude buried deep within them. She wasn't sure what would come next. They had no way of knowing how the ritual would unfold or what the cost would be, but for the first time there was a spark of hope, something that had been lost for so long. And even if the road ahead was lined with darkness, they had each other. Together they would rise from the ruins. The storm raged overhead, the wind howling like some ancient, wrathful beast, tearing through the trees and slashing across the jagged stones that marked the ancient circle. Rain lashed at their faces, cold and relentless, but neither Elias nor Marissa flinched. The air around them hummed with raw power, crackling with magic that pulsed through the very earth beneath their feet. They stood together, side by side, surrounded by the circle of towering stones, each one carved with symbols older than time itself. The ritual had begun. Elias could feel the pull of the darkness inside him, tugging at his very soul, its presence as suffocating as the storm that lashed around them. He gritted his teeth, his fingers trembling as he held the old weathered parchment in his hand. The incantations were there, laid out in the most desperate of hopes, but even as his eyes scanned the words, he knew this was the moment. This was when everything would either fall apart or come together. "Are you sure about this?" Marissa asked, her voice barely audible over the howling winds. Her gaze was unwavering, but Elias could see the raw emotion beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't just here for the ritual. She was here for him. Elias glanced at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't have a choice, do I?" His voice was tight, strained with both exhaustion and the power raging within him. "You've never had a choice," Marissa replied, her eyes flashing with that familiar fire. "But I'm with you, Elias. You don't have to face this alone." He swallowed, his heart heavy with gratitude and fear in equal measure. She had always been by his side, even when he didn't deserve it. And now, as they stood on the precipice of the final battle, he realized just how much he owed her. The words of the incantation slipped from his lips, the magical energy building around them like a storm of its own. The air grew heavier and Elias's body tensed, his muscles aching with the strain of controlling the power surging through him. His heart pounded, his mind warring with the beast that writhed inside him, demanding to be freed. It was too much. The pull of the wolf, the primal need to let go, to give in, was nearly unbearable. He could feel the dark, animalistic rage clawing at him, urging him to release it all. And then the shadows began to move. Figures cloaked in darkness emerged from the forest, their eyes glowing with malicious intent. The supernatural adversaries were closing in, determined to stop the ritual at all costs. The first few steps toward them were slow, deliberate, and then they moved faster, quicker. Their movements as fluid as shadows. Elias's pulse quickened. His breath came faster, his body stiffening, the wolf inside him clawing for release. The dark magic surged again, a wave of power that nearly knocked him off his feet. Marissa reached out, her hand finding his. "Focus," she urged, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're almost there." But Elias's eyes, darkened by the curse, wild with the rage of the wolf, flickered toward her. "Can't control it, Marissa," he growled, the sound more animal than man. "That's too much. It's taking me." Marissa's grip tightened on his hand, her voice unwavering. "You can control it. You've always been in control, Elias. You choose to be. You're not alone in this." The energy around them began to crackle with intensity, the wind howling like a living thing, swirling around them in a vortex of raw, untamed magic. The symbols on the stones flared, their glow growing brighter, feeding the ritual. But Elias's internal battle raged on, a war between his humanity and the savage wolf that sought to dominate him. The transformation was a physical agony. His body trembled, his skin crawling as the wolf pushed against his bones, his vision blurred, his heartbeat erratic. The pain was blinding, the force of it nearly overwhelming. "Marissa," he gasped, his voice thick with both the rage and the vulnerability he had never shown her. I can't stop it. You can," she insisted, her eyes fierce, her voice cutting through the storm. "You're not just a monster. You're a man. And you choose who you are. You're not the curse. You're Elias." Her words were the spark, the catalyst. The change hit him like a wave of fire and ice. The darkness inside him receded just for a moment as he fought to keep control. His eyes flashed with the last remnants of his human soul, his will, his choice. And then, with a burst of force, the wolf was freed, but not in the way it had been before. This time, he didn't lose himself. He embraced it. In that moment, the full moon above them seemed to align with the ritual, casting its light across the stone circle, and Elias's transformation completed itself. He stood before Marissa not as a mindless beast, but as a creature who had earned his place, a being who embodied both the wildness of the wolf and the humanity of the man he had fought so hard to protect. The supernatural adversaries faltered for a moment, stunned by the power radiating from him. But Elias's gaze, still wild but now controlled, shifted to them. With a growl that rippled through the air, he moved forward, his form an unrelenting force, and the enemies fell back knowing they had no chance against him. And then, as the last of them retreated into the storm, Elias staggered to a stop, his body still trembling with the aftermath of the transformation. The power of the ritual had taken its toll, physically and spiritually, but the curse was broken. He was free. Marissa rushed to him, her heart in her throat as she saw the toll it had taken on him. His body was scarred, his breath shallow, but the change was undeniable. The man she had fought for was still there, beneath the wolf, still alive, still with her. "You did it," she whispered, her voice shaking as she cupped his face in her hands. "You're you. You're not lost." Elias's breath came in jagged gasps, but he smiled, tired but genuine. "Thanks for believing in me." His body sagged against her, but he didn't collapse. They stood together, holding each other in the aftermath of the storm, both of them scarred, both of them changed, but they had faced the darkness, and in the end it wasn't just Elias who had been reborn. It was them. Together they had won, but the victory had come at a cost, and they both knew that. The scars would remain on both their bodies and their hearts, but for the first time, Elias was finally free, and so was she. The sky was awash with the soft hues of dawn, the sun's first rays creeping over the horizon, casting a gentle golden light across the city below. Elias stood at the top of the hill, the wind tousling his dark hair, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of his steady breath. His gaze swept across the city, the place that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable. And for the first time there was a sense of peace in his chest. The night's darkness, both literal and metaphorical, had given way to a new day, a new beginning. The transformation was complete. Elias flexed his hands, watching as the muscles rippled beneath his skin. He had never truly felt whole, not until this moment. The wolf, wild, untamed, and often uncontrollable, was now balanced with his humanity. The raw, brutal power that had once consumed him now coexisted with the man who had fought so hard to hold on to the parts of himself that still mattered. His senses were sharper, more attuned to the world around him, but the clarity he had fought for, the clarity he had finally earned, was just as strong. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to fight the man he was, and for the first time in years, Elias felt like he could breathe again. Marissa approached quietly, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her boots the only sound breaking the silence between them. She stopped next to him, standing shoulder to shoulder, the two of them gazing out at the city that stretched before them, bathed in the soft glow of the early morning light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and yet the weight of everything that had passed between them hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of what they had overcome. "You look different," Marissa said finally, her voice light, but there was a hint of awe in it. "Like a new person." Elias's lips quirked into a half-smile, a real one that reached his eyes and softened the harshness that had once defined him. "I feel different. Better. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly." He glanced at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You never gave up on me. Even when I couldn't believe in myself, you did." Marissa's heart fluttered at his words, the rawness in his voice cutting straight to her soul. She turned to face him fully, her gaze soft, filled with understanding. "You had to see it for yourself. You had to find your own way out of the darkness." She smiled, the warmth of it reaching her eyes. "And now, you found it. You're free." The wind picked up, swirling around them, but there was no longer the weight of uncertainty. There was only the future, one they would walk together. Elias took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. The contact, simple as it was, sent a spark of warmth through her. His gaze softened, the flicker of something deep within him that she had always seen but never fully understood, now visible in full. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, for showing me that there's more to life than just surviving." Marissa's throat tightened, but she swallowed the lump that had formed. "There's no such thing as giving up on you, Elias. Not after everything we've been through. I believe in you, and I always will." Elias's eyes glimmered, but there was no sadness there. No darkness, only a quiet, steady resolve. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, no matter what it is." Marissa's smile widened, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "We're in this together," she said, her voice unwavering. "Always." The day stretched out before them, the sun now fully risen and casting its golden light over the world, filling the air with the promise of something new, something better. Elias stood still for a moment longer, his gaze distant as he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His fingers brushed his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the pulse of life that was no longer weighed down by the curse. The wolf inside him was still there, but it no longer controlled him, it no longer consumed him. Instead, it had become a part of him, a part of his strength, his power, his balance. He could feel the changes deep inside him. The wolf was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace, something to work with. He had made peace with it and with himself. He was whole. He turned to Marissa, his heart swelling with a gratitude he didn't quite know how to express. She had been his anchor through everything, the storms, the chaos, the darkness, and now she was the light that guided him forward. Marissa's gaze met his, her eyes filled with something that wasn't just love. It was an understanding, a deep, unspoken connection that neither of them needed to explain. "We've made it through the worst of it," she said, her voice soft but strong. "And we're still standing." Elias nodded, his chest swelling with emotion. "We are. Together." As the day unfolded around them, the city began to stir with life. People moved through the streets, oblivious to the battle that had been fought in the shadows. But Elias knew. He knew what it had taken to get to this point, and he wasn't going to take it for granted. Not again. He and Marissa had faced the darkest parts of themselves, and together they had risen from the ruins. They had conquered the curse, not just through magic, but through the strength of their bond, their love, their unwavering belief in each other. The future was uncertain, yes, but as they stood together watching the world begin anew, Elias knew that he was no longer a prisoner of his past. They had fought for redemption, and in that fight they had found a new beginning, a new dawn, and this time they would face it together, stronger than ever before.